Aloha, everybody, and welcome to this episode of the Triple F Podcast, Faith and Family First. I'm your host, Eva Andrade. I'm here with co-host Jim Hochberg, and we're going to talk about why women are better than men. So stay tuned.
Women are better than men.
I agree.
In some things.
Show's over.
In some things they are.
Well,
they give birth way better than men. I don't care what they tell you in
Jim,
biology these days.
Jim, there are people in this world right now that are listening to this going, men can give birth too, Jim Hochberg.
Worse than that, they're probably calling me dirty names.
I'm sure. In fact, if you want to send an email, it's jim@jameshochberglaw.com. Actually, Jim, what I want to talk about today, because it's rearing its head again, it always does, is this the Equal Rights Amendment. Mm-hmm. What is it, and why does it keep coming up?
And so, for people that don't know, it's the ERA.
The ERA, right? So for people like us who existed back in the 70s, we might remember.
I was born in the 50s.
I was born in the 60s.
Okay.
But that means that our brain was working, though, in the 70s. And
well, I don't know. That's up to debate.
I don't know about you, but I had a very strict parent. My mind was working well back then. But so let's start with this, Jim, in case there are people listening that were raised under a rock and don't know what the Equal Rights Amendment is. For all our Native American listeners.
You're getting confused with Phyllis Schlafly, who was greatly involved.
Greatly involved. So take us back into time. Well, first of all, we know that the first.
Well, let's talk about the Constitution in general.
Okay, let's do it.
So, in 1789 or 87, the Constitution was ratified, and it included how you amend it.
Okay.
And you can amend the Constitution of the United States of America two ways. In fact, one, the Convention of the States is kind of percolating around the country right now, including in Hawaii. But that's the other one. The way basically that the Constitution's always been amended before is Congress will introduce an amendment, and they have to pass it by supermajorities, and then it goes to the states, and 3/4 of the states have to approve it. So 100 years ago, when women were just voting, and a whole 100 years ago, Congress wanted to pass this Equal Rights Amendment when women were women and smokes were smokes, or something like that.
Yes, there was no doubt back then.
Yeah.
Now, that doesn't mean that there weren't people back then who maybe thought one way or the other, but this was when women dressed as women, regardless of what they did when they were in their secret abode, right? And men were men.
Correct.
Okay.
So the Equal Rights Amendment was proposed, which basically said that in the United States, there would be no discrimination on the basis of sex, which meant your chromosomes. That's what it meant 100 years ago, XX or XY, right? And it did not get the number of votes to pass it, and decades went by and decades went by.
Because you need 38 states.
You need 38 states because that's the 2/3, right?
Right.
And so then in 1970, another state approved it. And so all of a sudden, after a long period of kind of dormancy, it was like, oh, we can pass this thing again. And of course, this was now, it wasn't 100 years ago when women were first getting the right to vote. 1970s was after Woodstock, totally different birth control things. Womanhood and life in America was completely different by then compared to in the 1920s. But it's really way different even now compared to the 1970s. But we'll get to that too.
Right.
So then some states started saying that it was still worthy of approval because states were now starting to approve it.
Now, Congress, the one thing that you didn't mention is that Congress said that you have to do this within a 7-year time period, right? To get the 38.
Correct.
The 38 states, okay.
Which did not happen.
And well, depending on who you're talking to, right? Because that's why we're here today talking about this, because some people don't see it that way.
Correct.
Okay.
So the interesting thing is, behind all of this discussion today lurks my favorite character. Voting.
Bing, 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 bing,
Voting. Because as you're going to see, elections had consequences with this particular thing.
Now, it's interesting. You mentioned Phyllis Schlafly.
Eagle Forum.
She worked really hard to actually fight against the movement that was happening in the 1970s. And her work was so passionate and so well received that there were several states that actually rescinded their original approval, that's really interesting to me, that you'd have states on board and then they would turn around and say,
but 100 years is 100 years.
Well, right.
It's not the same congressman. It's the same states,
Right.
but it's different humans.
Right.
Well, why don't you tell us Phyllis's perspective? Why was she so against this?
Well, so as a woman, she knew that there would be a way to protect women with upcoming voting and protections of the law. But even back then, there was some concern about the way that it was written and what it would mean. And now it's so funny. It was almost like she was prophetic, because it is a simple statement. I mean, when you look at the statement that they're questioning, let me see if I can find it. It's actually very simple, but
it's nothing
complex.
like the kind we get here.
But it's complex in the way that it could be translated by the courts.
Correct.
And you and I have talked about that on other issues relating to gender and identity, especially as you mentioned, whose butt is sitting in the office, who is making those decisions, who is voting for what, because they're going to take whatever their belief system is. Okay, I work for someone that used to say that somebody's BS is going to become law.
Okay.
Somebody's belief system is going to become law.
Big smiling,
right? So when you bring your belief system into the public square, then that's going to push how you vote on things. And so Phyllis's concern back then on what it could mean has transpired to today on how some legislators are viewing what it could mean.
Well, and in the last couple of years, this transgender thing has popped up out of nowhere after the L, the B, and the G got what they needed in civil rights. All of a sudden, we've got the T. And when the Supreme Court ruled, I don't know, within the last 5 years, I think, that it was a violation of the non-discrimination on the basis of sex statute from Congress in employment under Title VII for a funeral parlor to fire a salesman who was selling funeral services to people whose relative just died because he transitioned from a man to a woman. And that's the employer did not want to add that weird thing to the grieving process of their customers. It wasn't like they were selling Corvettes. And the United States Supreme Court said, even though when Title VII was enacted by Congress decades ago to prohibit discrimination on the basis of sex in employment, the word sex in employment did not mean what you think your gender is. It meant your chromosomes. For purposes of modern day application in the last 5 years, the U.S. Supreme Court said sex also means gender identity and expression and sexual orientation and expression. Right. And there's no further appeal of that ruling unless Congress wants to address it, which they don't.
Right.
So when the Equal Rights Amendment is now back on the stage prohibiting discrimination in anything on the basis of sex, it probably includes the things from that Supreme Court. We don't know because it doesn't say. And so I think you should urge your congressman to make sure it says what it needs to say so everybody knows what it means when they're voting for it.
So that's,
because we don't want to assume
right.
it means all the T stuff too.
Right. So that's one aspect of this that's problematic. Now, the reason that the topic's coming up again is because, fast forwarding past the 1970s, in 2017, it was Nevada. They voted to ratify this
Constitutional amendment,
right? And then in 2020, Virginia
that's right.
voted. And then when that happened, that apparently, according to some people, gave them the 38 states they needed.
But the Justice Department said,
and this was
correct.
Biden's Justice
Correct.
Department came back and said absolutely not. Now, and even Ruth Bader Ginsburg said that if people really want the Equal Rights Amendment, what they need to do is it needs to go back to the beginning, and it needs to start over and get the 38 states. But there's a move on some people to say, no, we have the 38 states already. And they're even questioning the 7-year time period. They're even questioning whether some states, took back their ratification or not, and all of that stuff. And I think that we bring this topic here to Hawaii because right here in our state legislature, they're passing a Senate resolution and a Senate concurrent resolution that's asking President Biden to declare that it has been fulfilled.
Now, it's pretty silly and foolish for our state legislature to do that because, as you pointed out, the Biden administration told the states when Nevada and Virginia supposedly adopted it that they couldn't because it was too late and they failed and all these things. So they sued. But for our legislators here in Hawaii in 2023 to ignore the fact that the Biden administration announced officially from the Justice Department that position, to then pass a resolution asking them to, change their position, it's a waste of time.
Yep.
But here's the other thing, and where the voting really comes in. Something key happened. Virginia, Missouri, Nevada filed a lawsuit against the federal government for taking that position because they want a court to rule that they are right and we can go forward with the Equal Rights Amendment as written now. And then Virginia withdrew from the complaint, canceled the complaint. Why? Well, they did it in 2022. Why? Because there was an election in Virginia and the governor became Governor Youngkin, not the other guy. And Governor Youngkin is a very conservative Republican. So listen to me. You need to make sure that you're always voting for candidates who share your values. That's the basis of the voting. And don't just wait until you get your ballot and look who happens to be already on there. How about right now, today, in Honolulu, in early 2023, start thinking about and finding candidates that you can support who will put their name on the ballot so you don't have a list to pick from. You actually are participating in the process from the beginning.
Yep. And just so that people are fully aware, it's HCR 200, and that's the concurrent resolution, which means that now that it passed the Senate, it went to the House. And in the Senate, there was absolutely nobody who voted no. And there was 2 who were excused. So Senator Nishimoto and Senator Yamashita were excused. So that means that 23 senators voted for this.
And the thing is, if you're a conservative senator, which there are some, how do you explain in a soundbite how you're against equal rights for women?
Well, yeah.
That's the problem. But it's dishonest because that's not really the problem.
And I looked at the testimony. Now, there was only 3 testimonies, but one of the 3 was somebody who normally is on our side on all the issues, and they voted in support, or they submitted testimony in support. And I think it's because, again, if you're just looking at whether women should have equal rights, of course, I would be the first one.
But they already have equal rights.
I think that what happens is people are not looking at they're not drilling down to see what this really means and what could potentially happen. Because what I want to do is I want people to understand that you have groups like NARAL and all these women's organizations. And I want to quote some of them because I think that it's important that we hear what they have to say. So I'm going to pull up a couple of why they want this, right? So NARAL, now this comes directly from an email that they sent to their people. There's a copy of it. You can look at it if you pull up. This comes from a talking point paper that the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops put together, and they have all their footnotes. And that's why I read footnotes. Okay. And I go, so if you go to, and you see this actual NARAL email, it says, quote, with its ratification, the ERA would reinforce the constitutional right to abortion by clarifying that the sexes have equal rights, which would require judges to strike down anti-abortion laws because they violate both the constitutional right to privacy and sexual equality.
But they don't, because men can get abortions too.
I'm telling you, this is going to get crazy.
If men can get pregnant, they got to be allowed to get abortions, so there's no discrimination on the basis of sex.
Yep. Okay.
I hate this circular logic
no,
stuff.
it's very weird. And then the National Women's Law Center wrote an article in Associated Press, January 1st, 2020, and they say, quote, Emily Martin, and then they have in the box because they add this in so that people reading it know who they're talking about. That's a general counsel, okay, for the National Women's Law Center, affirmed that abortion access is a key issue for many equal right amendment supporters. She said adding the amendment to the Constitution would enable courts to rule that restrictions on abortion, quote, perpetuate gender inequality, end quote.
So why do they need it in the Constitution? Is it because of Dobbs?
You got it. You got it. And we knew that was now the National Organization for Women on their website. They have resources. They say, quote, an ERA properly interpreted. And when I saw this, I could hear Jim Hochberg singing in the background, right? So properly interpreted could negate the hundreds of laws that have been passed restricting access to abortion care. A powerful ERA should recognize and prohibit that most harmful of discriminatory acts. Now, what this means is they would immediately go after all the red states that have all of these laws. And let me make it clear, some of those laws have to do with minors and access to abortion.
And we have that problem here.
And we have that
because we require certain ages without parental consent of young women who have the capacity biologically to get pregnant. So they would have the medical desire perhaps to have an abortion. And there's an amendment going through the state legislature right now to put into the Constitution the fundamental right of the individual to reproductive health care, including abortion and contraceptives. If you vote on that, if you vote yes, then that means the individual cannot be stopped from exercising their fundamental right to abortion and contraceptives. That means there can't be any age limitation.
That's right. And you brought that up in the hearing. You know, you the only one who brought that up in the hearing. The other thing that I saw on a quote by the National Organization for Women, it brought up memories of you, and you have been fighting this issue since the 1980s. But this is the quote from the National Organization for Women. The ERA would require strict scrutiny in challenges to the many state laws that deny LGBTQIA persons equal access to public accommodations, permit discrimination in housing, employment discrimination, credit and retail services, jury service, and educational programs, among others. So you see right there exactly what they're doing.
That is the longstanding constitutional test for whether the government may impose restrictions on a right. Strict scrutiny is impossible for the government to win because it requires that they have a compelling state interest and their proposed method of limiting the exercise of this right is, in fact, the least restrictive way to accomplish that compelling state interest. And the government almost never wins that standard in a court case. And so we talked in another show about the shiny objects on the lures that catch the fish. This is one. Don't get caught on this hook. think, use your brain. And remember, we've done several shows on charter amendments on the ballot and constitutional amendments on the ballot. And so I'm going to do a little reminder here, because Equal Rights Amendment is proposed as a constitutional amendment. The abortion access constitutional amendment being worked on right now in the state constitution by the legislature here. Those are constitutional amendments. Please, when the government is proposing to amend the Constitution, remember, they're trying to make the world easier for them, not you. Therefore, start with a no and make them change your mind.
Yep. And there's a show. We'll try to see if we can find that link that you can put it in the bottom. That I can put in the bottom so that you can go and check it out, because Jim talks about that. Change my mind. He turns into Louder with Crowder.
I like that
Change
show.
my mind. Okay. So going back to some of the concerns that the Equal Rights Amendment, should they go this route, could do. Another thing that the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops have a fear is about religious liberty and conscience protection. And what they say is that the government could argue that a decision not to perform an abortion, transgender surgery, or any of that kind of stuff is sex discrimination. And if that happens, they could go against any of these hospitals that receive federal funding. And let's be honest, there's a lot of great faith-based hospitals that do take federal funds for what they do. And this could infringe on their religious freedom.
Well, what the church should also be thinking about is, when the United States Supreme Court unanimously ruled that religious organizations have the absolute discretion to discriminate in employment with their, what's the word? The people that teach the faith in their organization. That was based on a federal statute, so that the Catholic Church has been protected in not being forced to let women be priests under the Title VII issue, because it's a religious organization and the priests are the messengers of the gospel, so they're protected. Once discrimination on the basis of sex jumps over the statutes and into the Constitution will override that statute. And now all of a sudden, Catholic Church very well may get sued for not having women priests.
Well, it could be dragged down to Protestant evangelical churches who have certain rules and regulations for who they hire to, whether it's to teach.
But the juicy target is the Catholic
it always
Church.
Is. But we're seeing in today's world, though, they're going after anybody faith-based who's willing to take a stand for Christ and for what we believe as Christians.
Well, we're going to do another show. But did you notice this past week it was revealed in the Congressional Judiciary Committee that the FBI
is going after Catholics.
Tasked
Yes.
particular undercover agents with going undercover into Catholic Church looking for domestic terrorists.
And I guarantee you that they're doing it in Protestant and evangelical churches too. Now, you're right that Catholics are the low-hanging fruit, but I'm telling you that they need to be more worried about some of these fundamentalist Christian groups who are way more stringent, right, on some of these things.
Well, I don't know. How much more dangerous can you get than those 40 Days for Life Catholics praying outside of Planned Parenthood?
Well, it's
for 40 whole days. That's more than a month.
It's very scary. And I also heard that there is an individual that is harassing the people that go down to pray at 40
Here locally?
Here locally. And because of that, the local people who run 40 Days for Life told people to stop going to pray at Planned Parenthood.
They should just hire off-duty police officers.
I had a conversation with them to encourage, because we should never be intimidated
Correct.
by that. I think that there's different ways they could do it. But the point is that there are attacks that are going after faith-based groups right now. Let's take a couple of minutes because we could do another whole show on why the ERA would be a bad thing. But I think people need to understand what the difference between a bill and a resolution is, because this was a Senate resolution that passed and a Senate concurrent resolution that is probably going to pass as well.
But the legislature can't pass a bill to tell Congress to do something.
It's not a bill. This is a resolution.
That's why it's a resolution.
Right.
It's just their attitude.
Right. So when we talk about that, our local legislature is doing a resolution, it really is, this is how we feel, and we encourage.
And it
we,
shows up in campaign literature.
Yes, it does, that
Yeah.
they signed off on this. So it's not as horrible as if it was a bill, because they couldn't do that anyway. But it does look like we have some congressional people that are willing to, fuddle a little bit on what can be done to pass this Equal Rights Amendment into the Constitution without going through the proper channels. So we do have to stay on top of that.
So in this issue with Equal Rights Amendment, in all these political, cultural issues that we deal with all the time, it seems like we're on defense. You and I go to the legislature here, and it seems like we're on defense, and we're always losing the argument to the people in power. But I was watching something over the Easter weekend, and they said something that was really cool. And that was, in our efforts to allow our community to live according to our faith, we're not on defense because we already won.
Read the end of the book.
It's in the back of the book.
The Cliff Notes. Remember Cliff Notes?
Yeah.
The Cliff Notes says Jesus won.
That's right.
That's the entire Cliff Notes for the Bible. Well, because Jesus wins, we win.
Correct.
Because we are served. That's our master, right? That's who we serve.
So that's why we can approach these issues with joy and peace and calmness, and not have to do some of the dumb stuff that we see in these conversations.
Well, I have this conversation with people all the time. It's like, we have a choice, you and I do, every time we go and testify. And you and I are different in our personality tactics. So you're a lot more strong.
You're a
than
woman's
I am.
is.
I'm a woman's is, and I'm proud to be. In fact, I'm on day 5 being a woman. I am so proud of being a woman for days, right? So
I'm going to get you a coin.
And women who have grown up as women, right, understand that every day being a woman means something. There is something precious from the moment you learn to walk, and all the daddies in the world that know. And in fact, our producer in the back over there, new daddy.
New dad.
There is something about that feeling of looking at your precious daughter, knowing that, this, I want to protect and I want to love her. And to get to the point where you're like, well, don't call her a her though. She gets to pick, or, the child gets to pick, this assigning things. The bottom line is this: millions of years from now, Jim, when they dig up your bones, they're going to go, this was a guy. And I don't care whether you wore a dress or not, because the DNA is going to say male. When they dig me up, female. So, you go ahead and do whatever you want to do. And for us Christians, we know that when we face the Lord on Judgment Day, we're going to be going, wait, what just happened? Because we're going to be facing him in how he created us, in the truth of who we are.
Okay.
And I just want people to be mindful of that they have a creator that loves them. Every single muscle and bone in their body was created, knitted together lovingly. So we want to see you next week on the show. So make sure you stay tuned, like, subscribe, share, hit that notification button so you know every time we upload a new video. Comment. And if anything we missed, make sure that you tell us, because Jim reads every comment. Don't you, Jim?
No.
We'll see you all next week. Mahalo, everybody.
Aloha.